All right, everyone. I'm excited to introduce my next guest, writer, producer, director, and author of one of my most cherished books on my bookshelf, The Twilight Zone Companion, a definitive guide to the classic series. My guest has also written for numerous iconic TV shows, including Star Trek, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Babylon 5. But right now, get ready to enter the wondrous world of imagination with my guest, Marc Scott Zicree. Hello.
Hey, glad to be here, Jeff.
Oh my goodness. I have loved, like many, the Twilight Zone forever. And not to throw names around, but Anne Serling gave me your email, which you know. So that was exciting. I have had your book, no
Mm.
kidding, like forever. You think this could be like maybe an early, a first, maybe an early.
Yeah, I think it is. Whenever people show me their dog-eared copies, they're falling to pieces. I'm very gratified because it means they loved the book, they really read it, and it's just, I love. I wouldn't want to see pristine copies that no one's ever cracked open.
There was a time where I think I had the entire book memorized. Like anyway, if anyone had said any particular episode, I could be like, oh, that one I found in the book, which is kind of hilarious. I must have pulled this out of a magazine.
Ah,
It's to order the VHS
yes,
episodes,
yeah.
which I believe I ended up buying a bunch of those. I think I have the DVDs, and then you did the Blu-rays.
Yeah, well, I've actually done all the home video versions. So, for instance, those VHS tapes, I wrote the liner copy. You'd crack them open, then there'd be like a couple of pages of background notes on all the episodes. Yeah, so I've been involved with all of including the Laserdisc. I've been involved with all of them.
Tell me when you got obsessed with the Twilight Zone and what led you to write one of the early kind of TV books, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
It was, I actually, I think I'm responsible for creating the genre, basically, because prior to the Twilight Zone Companion, the attitude was, well, why would people want to read about a show that's ended its network run years ago? Companion came out and it sold like 500,000 copies, and then they understood that there was a market. So I've been a fan of the Twilight Zone since I was a kid. When I was around, I don't know, 8 years old, it went into syndication and it was running 5 days a week in the afternoon on KTLA here in Los Angeles. And so I would just come home from school and watch episodes. And it just became sort of our common mythology. All the kids at school would talk about the episodes. It was super fun. I grew up during the space race in the 60s. So science fiction and reality were very intermingled. You'd see science fiction writers on like being interviewed by Walter Cronkite about the space race, Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury and so forth. And Rod Serling was just kind of like a member of the family. I mean, he was so present between that and Night Gallery and the game shows he would appear on and all sorts of stuff. So Twilight Zone and Outer Limits and the original Star Trek all debuted when I was a kid, and those are the three shows that made me want to be a writer. And so that was the beginning of it all.
amazing. All right, so what's the origin of the book? I know George Clayton Johnson, one of the big
Yeah,
co-writers, I guess,
yeah,
contributing writers,
yeah.
gave you the
Um,
idea.
no, here's basically the evolution of it. As I mentioned, that when I was a kid, Star Trek, Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, I noticed that they were all sort of being written by pretty much the same guys, more like a handful of people were writing all of these shows, and they were also the same names on the books I was reading. So whether that was Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, George Clayton Johnson, he co-wrote Logan's Run, the novel with William F. Nolan, Harlan Ellison, on and on and on, Theodore Sturgeon. As soon as I was a teenager, I started going to science fiction conventions and meeting these writers who were my heroes. I didn't particularly care about meeting Leonard Nimoy. I wanted to meet, George Clayton Johnson. And he wrote Kick the Can and Nothing in the Dark and Game of Pool on Twilight Zone. He wrote the first episode of Star Trek that ever aired, the one with the salt vampire. So George and I became very good friends. When I was a teenager, I interviewed him for a book I was doing for one of my college classes called Three Interviews on Media and Society. So I interviewed him and Theodore Sturgeon and Ron Cobb, who was a great visual concept designer on movies like Aliens and Star Wars and so forth. So when I got out of college, I got an art degree, painting, sculpture, and graphic arts. I was trying to decide whether to be an artist or a writer. When I was 19, I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop, which is a big science fiction writing workshop, and sold my first short story to one of my teachers, Damon Knight, who was the writer who wrote the short story "It's a Good Life," or not "It's a Good Life," "To Serve Man," "To Serve Man." So this was, I knew of him, of course, from the Twilight Zone episode. I got out of college and I knew I wanted to be a writer, producer in TV, but there were no classes in that. There was no way to learn that. And so I thought, well, it was 2 years after Rod's death, 1977, and I was like 21, 22 years old, and I thought, well, if I write a book about one of the greatest shows ever made, if not the greatest show, I'll learn how to do this. By studying the best show, I'll learn how to make great TV. So it was partially my curiosity about the show itself, and it was partially I wanted to learn this. So I spent 3 months interviewing people who'd worked on the show, starting with George, before I even went to Carol Serling, Rod's widow, because I knew that if I went directly to her as someone who had only sold one short story and never even taken a journalism class, she'd already turned down major journalists who wanted to write about Rod and the Zone. So I thought, well, okay, I'll spend 3 months researching it and interviewing people. And by then I went to Carol. And so I knew a lot about the subject. I knew how I was going to do the book. She clearly could talk to George or to Buck Houghton or any of the other people I'd interviewed, and they must have given me a good, referral because she then said, okay, you've got access to everything. And that was phenomenal.
So when you say access to everything, what does that mean?
Well, first off, I interviewed over 100 people who worked on the show ultimately, but the great part, see, if Rod hadn't died at age 50 in 1975, I wouldn't have written that book because obviously the one to write a book about Twilight Zone should have been Rod Serling, right? But he was gone, and I thought, well, why not me? Rod's house was exactly as he'd left it. It was only 2 years after his death, so the house in Pacific Palisades it still had one room that was entirely the trophy room with all the six Emmys and the three Hugo Awards and the Peabody Awards and all of that. Even his dog was still there, this senile Irish setter. In the back of the house, there was a guest house, and that was Rod's office. And there was one wall that was entirely science fiction paperbacks from 1959 to 1964, and many of them had never even been cracked open. And on the inside front cover of every single one of them, stamped in red, was property of CBS. So clearly Rod had said, send me every book that's published about science fiction, and they had. In the garage, there were piles of Twilight Zone episodes in film cans, 60 millimeter prints, piled high. In the attic were his scrapbooks and the boxes of, there were file cabinets and boxes. I opened one box and it was scripts that had never been made, Twilight Zone scripts by Matheson and Beaumont, two by Ray Bradbury. It was just like the treasure trove. It was amazing.
Okay, so you're a kid in the candy store with
Mhm.
all this. Like, how
Yeah.
long did it take you to watch these things, to sort through them, to, I
Oh,
guess,
from the
it,
month I started the book to the month it came out was 5 years. By the time I was 22 or 23, I was writing for television, Smurfs, He-Man, Super Friends, Real Ghostbusters. That's how I broke in. But the Twilight Zone Companion was my main project through that entire period. See, the problem was that when I started the book, there were no VCRs. You couldn't record a show. You could record it on audio cassette, but you were also the only access you had were episodes that were airing, and they were cut down. They cut several minutes out of them to add more commercials and syndication. And Rod's contract was that he was supposed to get two 16 millimeter prints of every episode. But as the show went on, it became much more haphazard. So some episodes he'd have 4 copies of, some he'd have no copies of, and then some, like the hour ones, he might only have the second half hour or the first half hour of the hour episode. But these were pristine 16 millimeter prints. They had the original commercials. They had his coming attraction spots. So ultimately Carol would let me carry home a whole pile of these 16 millimeter film cans, and I'd bought a 16 millimeter projector, and I would just put them on the projector and watch them and take notes and record the audio. And that was invaluable. And the funny part was there were 2 episodes that for some reason Rod didn't have them and they never aired. So I called KTLA, which was the local LA station. I said, hi, I'm writing a book on the Twilight Zone, and there's 2 episodes I've never seen you air. And the guy said, well, what are the 2 episodes? So I told him, I was expecting he would say, come on in, we'll put them on a little moviola and you can watch them. He said, okay, we'll air them next week. So in all of LA saw those 2 episodes because I needed to see them. So that was
which
that was
two
pretty cool.
episodes were those?
One was The Gift, which is a very rarely seen episode about an alien who comes to Earth and he lands in a Mexican village. And
Oh, yeah, with the cure for cancer.
yeah, and originally Rod had written that as one of the pilots as an hour-long script called I Shot an Arrow into the Air, and it wasn't set in a Mexican village. It was just kind of more in America, and he kind of cobbled that and winnowed it down. It's not one of the better episodes, but that was one. And the other one I can't recall at this late remove. But then, of course, I found out there were 4 episodes that had never been syndicated, and then I had to, go in search of those as well.
Ruta Lee's episode was one of those.
Yeah, Yeah, it was yes, Sounds and Silences, The Encounter, the one with George Takei, Miniature, which is a great episode, an hour episode with Robert Duvall, and yeah, the one you're mentioning. So, but yeah, but now they're all available because I was able to get them back into release. So that was great.
Yeah, I feel the gift, the whole, oh no, we hated that person and we murdered the alien, but they were going to
Yeah.
give us cancer. I
Yeah.
feel like that trope, though, whether it was the best episode or
Yeah.
not,
No.
eventually got reused and
Yes. Yeah.
borrowed.
Well, many of the Twilight Zone episodes have been inspirations for many TV shows and movies over the years, of course, and books.
Do you have any favorites?
Of Twilight Zone episodes, sure.
No, no, no. Well, yeah, I want to get to that. No, do you have any favorites that were inspired by the
But
Twilight Zone?
yeah, I mean, clearly, Poltergeist, the movie Poltergeist, is influenced by Little Girl Lost, the Matheson episode where the little girl falls through the hole in dimensions. Obviously the Simpsons Halloween episodes, all the tropes they've done relating to Twilight Zone
Oh, the
episodes.
Treehouse of
Yes,
Terrors. Yeah,
Treehouse of
those are
Horror.
more homages. Those are, yeah,
Yeah,
those are fun.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's so many. Where do you start? I mean, all of us grew up watching the Twilight Zone. There's a huge ripple effect through all of our culture.
I feel like the Twilight Zone is like the Godfather. And what I mean by that is if you've never seen The Godfather, you don't realize how many things you watch that reference The Godfather.
Yes,
Like it's
yeah,
uncanny. Every movie references it in some way. The Twilight Zone's the same exact thing. There's
yeah.
all these subtle references. If you never watch it, you just think, "Oh, that's cute, clever, whatever." But you don't realize like how much these things have inspired everything.
Well, the thing that's so amazing about television, because really I'm the first generation of television kids, it's an incredibly powerful medium. Rod's idea initially during the 50s was that it would be like the Broadway stage, except that all of America could watch it. And so the idea was you could write these amazing pieces of work that would just, ripple out into millions of people, throughout the country instantaneously. And of course, as the censors got more and more of a grip on things, the sponsors and the censors, Rod felt more and more frustrated, and that's how he ended up creating and being the showrunner of Twilight Zone. He was really the first modern showrunner in that way, the writer who ran the show rather than the non-writing producer who had been over the writers prior to that.
I think that's why it's been so hard probably to replicate the
Mm,
magic of it because he was so much of it. Speaking
yeah.
of inspiration, do you watch Severance?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
Absolutely. Sure.
so the TV show Severance that is on, are you caught up?
I haven't watched all of the second season yet. I've watched the first season.
Okay, so are you aware that the final episodes, I don't want to ruin anything for you, but
Don't worry about
I
it.
got you, so I gotta have it. So
Yeah, please.
the second to last episode leading into the final episode was called the After Hours, and they literally quote like it's a literal quote where they use the woman's name and she's going to the ninth floor for a gold thimble, Miss Marsha White, right?
Wow.
The specialties department. But they
Huh.
said that the After Hours, the Mighty Casey, and A World of His Own were are heavily tied in somehow. Like they
Huh.
offer the clues. I don't know how much into it you are.
Well, I should reach out to them and. I mean, it's funny because there's at least half of all the people in Hollywood own the Twilight Zone Companion, and in many cases it was a book that proved instrumental in their lives in terms of them deciding to become writer producers in TV, particularly in science fiction. So, a lot of these guys I know, I mean Ron Moore and Joe Straczynski and so forth, most science fiction shows need that visionary at the top, whether it's Joe Straczynski with Babylon 5 or Roddenberry with Star Trek, or Chris Carter with X-Files. Usually there's one guy or maybe a team sort of with the vision to see it through. Ron Moore with the reinvented Battlestar Galactica, so, but they're all huge, huge, huge fans of Rod Serling.
All right. Well, you need to catch up because I need to,
Yeah, I'll watch it. I'll definitely check it out, Severance. You bet.
with Rod Serling's 100th birthday was not too long ago.
Right.
And what do you feel? How do you define his lasting legacy? Like 100 years, he would have been 100 years old,
Amazing.
50 years from the time he died, passed, almost
Yeah,
from the passed away. And you started this
1975.
book. I
1975. Yeah. I mean, he's had two enormous impacts. The first is on the public in general. The amazing irony is that if Rod hadn't been censored, if he hadn't, because Rod wanted to write about society and race and governmental issues, politics, all that stuff. So, when he wrote about non-societal flashpoints, like, for instance, Requiem for a Heavyweight about a boxer on the downward slide, there was no problem with that because it wasn't controversial. And it wasn't censored. But the irony is that if he hadn't wanted to write like about Emmett Till's murder, things like that, he never would have created Twilight Zone, and he would have just been writing stories of his day, and he'd be forgotten now by and large. He'd be linked with the other writers who were big back then, but generally forgotten now. Reginald Rose, Tad Moselle, Paddy Chayefsky even. But because he wrote Twilight Zone, he made it more universal. So he would be writing about the same issues, but in a way where it would resonate to any generation. For instance, Monsters Are Due on Maple Street is about how people can be manipulated to hysteria toward turning against each other instead of seeing who the real enemy is. And that's as timely today as it was when Rod wrote it, if not more so. Thanks to that, everyone has watched Twilight Zone. Everyone has, this is a cultural touchstone because they have such a depth of meaning. You can watch them over and over and again. They're never just about the gimmick, or rarely. Carol Serling, I'd run into her periodically, and she'd say, "I'm always amazed at how this is just continuing, that it's as popular as it ever was." I was gratified too, because when I wrote the book, I had no idea if Twilight Zone, 50 years later, if it would be still known even. I mean, there's so many shows that I grew up with that people never talk about, Bonanza or the High Chaparral or Mannix, but Twilight Zone, everybody knows. That was really gratifying. I think it's going to continue. I think 100 years from now, when I'm a head in a tank with nutrients, I'll be talking about Twilight Zone's, Rod's 200th birthday. But also, there's the enormous ripple effect in the creative community. And so, as I mentioned, the second golden age of television is largely thanks to Rod. Guys like David Chase, with The Sopranos, or Vince Gilligan with Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, they're huge Rod Serling fans. And they look to him as a model, as an icon of what the medium is capable of and how you run a show to keep power so that your vision reaches your audience. I mean, Rod was a warrior and a great inspiration for all of us.
Amazing answer. Thank you. That's I feel the same way. No, it's okay.
Yeah.
It is amazing though, and you're right. I mean, for anyone to remember, to be remembered
Yeah.
that fondly, and it's not like we're barely remembering him. It's not like,
No,
oh, it was his 100th, and we
no,
suddenly
no.
remembered it was his. It's
Well,
like
the other thing that's so interesting is that Rod is a pop culture icon himself. I mean, he is like the epitome of cool, along with Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, Bogart. There aren't that Elvis. There aren't that many who are instantly recognizable, and he's one of them. So I think that's pretty cool too. And that was a total accident. He didn't intend to be the narrator. It just happened by default because the first narrator they had, Westbrook von Voorhees, who had done the March of Time. He had this big booming voice that was totally wrong for Twilight Zone, and then they couldn't afford Orson Welles. And so Rod said, "Well, how about me?" And they kind of fell out of their chair laughing, but they gave it a whirl, and he turned out, of course, to be perfect.
he was only on screen from season 2 on, right? I mean, he did like teasers at the end,
Yeah,
but
but
as the opening narrator on screen, that sort of
I mean,
became that was a
yeah.
season 2 thing, right?
Yeah, but he'd been doing the coming attraction stuff, and he also was really well known. He was interviewed all the time, like Mike Wallace interviewed him. He was a very public figure, even from the beginning.
All right, so you were close then with Carol Serling and Anne. Are you close with Anne or like?
Yes, well, Anne and Jody both. I interviewed all three of them. I mean, it's amazing how gracious they were to even let me in to interview them. I mean, I was going up into that attic and pouring through things for years, and so, I mean, for them, Rod's death was very, very recent. It was 2 years since he had died. And of course, they were stunned by his death at 50. I mean, he went in for open heart surgery. The expectation was that he would recover. And instead, he died, and really, really a shock. So that grief was very fresh. It was a fresh wound when I started working on the book. But so I interviewed Anne and Jody both when they were like in their early 20s, and I've known them ever since, a lot as with Carol until her death.
What are some of the things that you found that surprised you the most when you were digging through everything?
Well, the big surprise ultimately was I learned that Charles Beaumont, one of the principal writers of Twilight Zone, when he was 33, he started exhibiting symptoms that were ultimately diagnosed as presenile dementia. So for the last season and a half of Twilight Zone, all of the scripts credited to him were either co-written or entirely written by his friends. So he could still get assignments, but he was losing the ability to write. And so, for instance, the episode Living Doll was actually ghost written by a writer named Jerry Soule. This was totally unknown. No one had ever talked about it. No one had ever credited writers who ghost wrote for Beaumont. So I was really glad they let me in on that. And I could give the credit where credit was due. Beaumont died at 38, and he looked like a 90-year-old man. William F. Nolan, who was one of his friends, said, like his character Walter Jameson, he just dusted away. So that's amazing. So that was a surprise and really interesting. And then with Rod, it was just going deeper and deeper and deeper into that material, that life, and finding out. My curiosity, one of my reasons for writing the book was, how do you grow up to be able to write these kind of stories? What kind of background do you have where you can imagine these things? Because these were stories that no one had ever written before. I mean, kick the can, how George Clayton Johnson come up with that, and so forth. So that was fun. It was amazing to realize that Rod dictated his scripts. That was phenomenal. Matheson told me that once he tried to dictate a script and he couldn't do it. It's really a unique talent that Rod had.
I mean, you found a lot of there's some cool stuff like an unused opening in the book, and you talk
Yeah.
about you mentioned the scripts that you found that were not used. Any chance that any of those scripts would ever see the light of day, or have they? Or
I hope so. Some of them have. For instance, Matheson wrote a script called The Doll, and on the final season of Twilight Zone, Burt Granite left the show as producer and William Frug took over. And because of that, the script that Matheson had written called The Doll was not shot, and instead Living Doll was, the one with Talkie Tina. Matheson's script was about these sort of two lonely people, middle-aged people, who find these dolls that look like them, look like each other, and they're drawn together through this. And it was ultimately made as an episode of Steven Spielberg's Amazing Stories. And John Lithgow starred in it, and it won him an Emmy.
oh
So
wow,
that was shot. But most of these scripts haven't been filmed, particularly the Serling ones. And I hope someday they will be. I really would love to see that.
who did you interview of the 100 interviews that was able to give you the most tea, the most information? Like Burgess Meredith was, some of the iconic ones, Jack
Well,
Klugman.
it was great to interview the actors. That was really, really fun, particularly Billy Mumy, because as a little kid, he memorized all of the lines. When they were doing a table read of It's a Good Life, he was correcting Cloris Leachman on her lines because he had everyone's lines memorized. He was like, 8 years old or whatever. I mean, I loved all of the interviews I conducted. They were all fascinating. Some people, though, were singular. I mean, Buck Houghton, who had been the great producer with Rod of the first three seasons, he was astonishing. He remembered every episode. He remembered details of everything. George T. Clemens, who was the phenomenal director of photography on Twilight Zone, won an Emmy for it. He, again, remembered details, specific details of every single episode, of what it was like to shoot it, how it was on the set. Really great. Douglas Hayes, who was the director of the After Hours and Eye of the Beholder and The Howling Man, many others. He was brilliant and very inventive. He was a visual artist as well, so he helped design the look of he called them the pig people in Eye of the Beholder, the grotesques. He said he went down to Bill Tuttle's makeup lab at MGM, and he got his fingers in the clay, so the two of them worked on those appliances together. So it was a cornucopia. It was just phenomenal. And the funny thing is, I recorded all of those interviews to then transcribe for the book. And it was only years later that you got home video, and I started excerpting those interviews for the Blu-ray and the DVD and so forth. So they proved to be very valuable in terms of a secondary usage. So I'm very glad of that.
Oh, so these 100 episodes are video. You
Well, the
extracted
interview,
the audio. So it's not like
well,
cassettes or something.
the the interviews I did were on audio cassette for the most part because again, the technology what didn't exist back in 77, 78.
Well,
You know,
maybe it was 500 pounds, but yeah.
Yeah, but it was but audio cassettes were great. They worked fine. And of course, almost all of those people, most of them, with exception of Billy Mumy, a few others, they're all gone now. Earl Hamner, so many people. I was very lucky that I got Matheson and George Clayton Johnson and Earl Hamner, the other major writers who were still alive. Beaumont had died, but I interviewed his son and William F. Nolan, who didn't write for Twilight Zone. He co-wrote Logan's Run with George Clayton Johnson, but he was part of that whole circle of friends, writers who were around Beaumont. And so he had a very detailed memory and and he kept notes on everything. And so he was a huge resource.
One of my favorite things was I interviewed Johnny Iman and
Hmm.
Stephen Talbot.
Hmm.
Both were in The Fugitive,
Hmm.
episode The Fugitive. That was like a big deal for me because like just when you find people that were in the Twilight Zone, like, oh yeah, we met Rod. You know, he was on the bench sitting there.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Well, the fun part is, The Fugitive is one of those episodes that's really good, and but no one ever brings it up but it's just like a really solid piece of work. Very touching with the little girl and the old guy who's an alien, really, really nice episode. Really fun.
let's use that as a pivot for my next question. So when people do say these are the classic episodes, I have them written down. I bet you could name five and we'd match five for five.
Sure.
So Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, It's a Good
Of course.
Life, Eye of the Beholder,
Yeah.
Monsters Are Due, we already talked about,
Mhm.
Time Enough at Last,
Sure.
Walking Distance, The Invaders, The Hitchhiker, Living Doll, To Serve Man. All amazing. We can dive into any one of those in a
Yeah.
second. But what are the the fugitives? What are the other ones that are amazing that people just don't talk about? Because I only named off 10 or so.
Yeah.
There's 150 or so. So
A lot of people don't know about the 18-hour-long episodes that was season four. There's some real jewels there. Miniature is a terrific episode that Charles Beaumont wrote that stars Robert Duvall. Death Ship is a great episode that Matheson wrote, starring Jack Klugman and Ross Martin, who are phenomenal in it. And then Jess Bell, Earl Hamner wrote that hour episode, and then of course Serling wrote On Thursday We Leave for Home, starring James Whitmore, and that's a phenomenal piece of writing about a guy who saves a group of stranded colonists on an alien planet. And he's literally kept them alive all these years. But when rescue comes, he can't let go of being the leader. And it ultimately leads to a very sad ending. And James Whitmore is just great, just great. So those are some of them. But there's so many great episodes. In Praise of Pip is a wonderful episode. Talkie Tina, as you mentioned, but Kick the Can, Nothing in the Dark. Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up? That's one of the rare comedies that really works. And hilarious about, a group of people stranded in a diner during a snowstorm, and one of them is a Martian in disguise. Really great. I interviewed John Hoyt, who was in that episode. He was the Martian. And I mean, you can name so many of them. The Purple Testament, probably one of the greatest things ever written about warfare, about the soldier who can see the look of death on the soldiers who are about to die. Death's Head Revisited, which is a great episode about the Holocaust, one of the best things ever written about the Holocaust. Yeah, I mean, I think you would be safe. I mean, there were 156 episodes of The Twilight Zone. Rod wrote 92 of them himself, an amazing output. But I think you could probably mention at least 100 episodes of The Twilight Zone of those 156 that are like really great. And there's a few bombs, but not many. Not many. So its batting average is extremely high. The Lonely, the one with Jack Warden falling in love with a female robot. Just brilliant, wonderful.
is that the one where they get rescued and he doesn't want to leave?
Right, you're right.
Okay.
They shoot her in the face. I mean, my God, that is so brutal. The fact that they show that in a TV show that was shot in 1959. I mean, holy cow, And it just gives you. I mean, you just like when you see that, you go like that. It's just great. It's just great.
Which ones would you consider at the bottom?
Cavender is Coming, which is the comedy with Carol Burnett. It was done as an offshoot pilot, and it has a laugh track. And then they stripped out. It's about a woman whose guardian angel visits her. And Rod. Most of the comedies that Rod wrote weren't very funny. They were a little leaden. It has a laugh track, which doesn't work at all. And then on the DVDs and the Blu-rays, they have a version you can watch without the laugh track. But in that, it's very weird because they'll say a line, then stop, and then they'll start talking again because they were timing it for the laugh track. So that one's pretty weird. There's one, Come Wander With Me. It's one of the last episodes shot. It's incoherent. It stars Gary Crosby. It's set in the backwoods. It's got this girl named Bonnie Beecher who sings. Liza Minnelli auditioned for that role, but William Frug thought Bonnie Beecher was the better, bigger talent, and so she didn't get the gig. But it's just one of those stories where it's like, what's the plot here? What's going on here? So that's a pretty weak one. You can name a handful, but I promise you that you would name one episode that is somebody's favorite episode. It's like because when I wrote the book, I didn't like the Bewitching Pool, which is the one about the two kids whose parents are getting divorced. And they dive into the swimming pool and find themselves in this backwood utopia for children run by this kind of creepy grandmotherly character. And I didn't like that one. And I got a letter from someone saying that's my favorite episode because when I was a kid, my parents were getting a divorce and nobody on TV was divorced. They were all happily married couples. And then I saw the Bewitching Pool and I realized I wasn't alone. And I thought, okay, that's valid. I can, so I actually, when I revised the Twilight Zone Companion, the new edition, where I added the 100 pages and the 500 new photographs and the audio video links and all that stuff, I wrote that as an addendum because it's like, okay, so I've changed my opinion on some episodes over the years. There's 6 episodes that were shot on black and white videotape, and those are amazing because they're so different. Originally, they were shown in really shitty 16 millimeter prints in syndication. They looked really grungy and odd when we did the Blu-rays. And now I think in syndication too, they've gone back to the videotape masters, the black and white videotape masters, and they're gorgeous. But so those are like, Long Distance Call, The Whole Truth, Lateness of the Hour, Night of the Meek. That's one of the great episodes of Twilight Zone, but it was shot on videotape because they were trying to find ways to economize. So they tried that as an experiment for 6 episodes, but they couldn't shoot exteriors, and that was too limiting for Twilight Zone. They couldn't just stay on a stage; it wouldn't work. So they went back to film.
Speaking of the worst ones, okay,
Yeah,
I'm going to read off a few, and
please.
this is from Paste Magazine. Every episode of the Twilight Zone ranked from worst to best. So they just ranked all. Now, before, not to sway you in any way, the
Yes.
opening, I'm going to read to you the opening of this article, okay?
Okay.
But don't let
Sure.
it
Yeah.
sway you, okay?
Okay. Sure.
In the introduction to his invaluable book, The Twilight Zone Companion, Marc Scott Zicree calls Rod Serling's game. Anyway, my point is,
Yeah.
you are the opening reference of this
I'm the
article.
guy. Yeah.
You're the guy.
Absolutely. I
They
love
love
being an
you.
icon.
All right, so
Yeah.
this is what they ranked number 156
Okay.
from season 4, episode 12. I Dream of Jeannie.
It's a bad one. Yeah, it's pretty wacky. I mean, it stars Howard Morris, who I like very much. I actually met him years later when he was directing animation that I was writing, and he had been part of your show of shows with Sid Caesar. Really an amazing comedic actor. But yeah, it's just funky. It's a funky episode, really wacky. Yeah, not a good one.
All right, number 155, also from season 4, episode 18, The Bard.
That one I might disagree with them because it's Rod writing about it's basically about a hack TV writer who summons up the ghost of Shakespeare to help him write TV scripts. It's got some funny things in it. It has Burt Reynolds doing his impression of Marlon Brando, which is pretty good, and playing a sort of a method actor named Rocky Rhodes, and John Williams, who starred in Dial M for Murder, the Hitchcock film. He plays Shakespeare, and he's really good. And Jack Weston, who was so great in Monsters on Maple Street, that heavy-set guy, he's the comedy lead, and he's funny. So it's a little leaden, but it still has its moments, because Rod certainly was writing from the inside of the television equation.
All right. Number 154 from season 2, episode 19, Mr. Dingle the Strong.
Of the 4, the Burgess Meredith, it's the weakest, yes, absolutely. But the aliens are so peculiar. There's this 2-headed alien, very weird looking, and then there's these 2 little kids who are made up as, I guess, Venusians or whatever the hell. It's not a great one. Burgess Meredith is a weakling who gets super strength, and okay, fine. Yeah, it doesn't really fly, let us say. Burgess Meredith tries his best.
Then up is A Quality of Mercy from season 3, episode 15.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with that one. It's a little bit heavy-handed in that it's about a World War II soldier who suddenly finds himself as a Japanese soldier, and it's Dean Stockwell, who's a very good actor. He was on Battlestar Galactica as well. I think because it's a white actor playing an Asian guy, it's a little more outdated because of that. But it's interesting. It's a little bit sort of like 1, 2, 3, 4. You sort of know where it's going. But I don't think it's as bad as they say. But go ahead.
The part of this I'm enjoying the most is your instant recall on all of these. That is it. Next is Hocus Pocus and Frisbee from season 3, episode 30.
It's Andy Devine. It should be better than it is. The basic gag is that there's a guy who's always telling these tall tales that aren't true, sort of a blowhard played by Andy Devine, who was in everything from, the movie Stagecoach on. He had this kind of raspy voice from when had an injury to his throat when he was a kid. And the gag is that he gets abducted by a flying saucer and escapes, and no one believes him, because, of course, nothing he says is true. It's okay. I mean, the one thing that's so great about Twilight Zone and in general TV of that era in its entirety is that you had this. See, the thing that younger people don't know or don't understand is when we were kids, there were three networks. That was it, three networks in syndication. So all the same actors appeared on every TV show. So you might see Andy Devine in an episode of Twilight Zone, and the next week he might be on an episode of Gunsmoke, or he might be on Petticoat Junction or whatever. It's like all of the actors were like an ensemble company that appeared in everything. And so they really were like members of the family, whether it's John Fiedler, who's in Night of the Meek, or, Inger Stevens, who would be in The Hitchhiker. You'd see them on every other show as well. And that was a good thing. That was fun because then it was like, oh, let's see what they're going to do with this role. Let's see how they're going to attack this part. It was very, very fun.
Okay, now let's flip. I'm going to go to the number one. Do you want to
Oh,
just
I
guess
like
what the
I
number
like
one
I
is?
like the list of bad ones because I've never
Okay.
heard those.
Well, we'll go back. We'll go back. I just wanted to
Okay,
see if
go
there's
ahead.
any best ones
Sure.
that
I
are
disagree with it.
also. The number one is Eye of the Beholder. Okay.
That's a pretty good one. Yeah, that's a good choice.
And
It's a
then
great.
Monsters are due on Maple Street, then Time
Well, when
Enough
you
to
asked about when
Last.
you asked about surprises, one thing I did discover that was a surprise was my friend Doug Hayes directed that episode. I found out two things about it that I didn't know. One was that the lead actress in that, who's a woman whose face is wrapped in bandages, who's waiting to see if the last surgery has made her look quote unquote normal. That was played by two different actresses. It was Maxine Stewart when her head's wrapped in bandages because she was very emotive and had a great voice. And then when they unwrap her and she's stunningly beautiful, it's Donna Douglas, who then would go on to play Ellie Mae in the Beverly Hillbillies. The other thing I discovered, and Doug only told me this. We became very good friends, he and I. And he only told me this years later after I wrote the book. When they were shooting Eye of the Beholder, it was running short, and Rod was out of town and not reachable. So Doug, who himself was a very talented writer, he wrote a scene in Serling style so that it would be up to runtime. And if you ever watch the episode, it was the scene in the break room where the nurse and the doctor are smoking a cigarette, and the doctor says, "I've seen under those bandages, it's a human face." When they screened the episode for Rod, Doug was in the back of the screening room just sweating bullets, wondering what Rod was going to say, and Rod just looked back at him after the episode ran, and he said, "Good scene." But that was Doug Hayes, uncredited, though. Wonderful.
I love
Sure.
that. Number four, best. I'll say number
Mhm.
five is Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. That's a
Great,
classic.
great, of
Number
course.
four is Shadow Play.
I don't know if I'd rank it that highly. I think it's a good episode. Basically, Dennis Weaver on trial for his life, and he's claiming that it's a dream. It's all a dream. Matheson used to dream. I'm sorry, Charles Beaumont used to dream in chapters where he'd go to sleep and it would pick up where the previous night's dream was left off. He also wrote an episode called Perchance to Dream about a guy having a recurring nightmare that's sequential. It's an okay episode. It's kind of Philip K. Dickian in the fact that it's playing with what's reality, what's not. It's okay. I wouldn't rank it that highly, though. No.
Mm. Then we got Five Characters in Search of an Exit.
It's a good episode, but I don't think it's one of the top five. William Wyndham's very good in it. It's about five characters who are trying to figure out where the hell they are. They're in this big, enormous cylinder. It's okay. It kind of, it has its little payoff. It's a little twist ending. The little girl at the end of it is actually the producer's daughter, Buck Houghton, his daughter Mona. It's okay. Not one of my favorites.
Speaking of inspirations, the trivia here is that this episode is known to have inspired Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. That's pretty crazy.
And then we got The Invaders.
Yeah, it's a good one. Though Matheson didn't like the way it was done. He thought that the little astronauts looked ridiculous. He said it was so slow. They took out he had a lot of stuff happening, and they took out about half of it, so it moves very slowly. But I think it's a good episode. Doug Hayes, who directed it, played those little characters. They were hand puppets, and you'd put your fingers in to make them walk, and then your fingers in to raise the little arms and fire the little ray gun. And so he was the voice at the end, the race of giants. That's Doug's voice. He said, because I was those little guys, so I figured it should be my voice too. Very funny.
Love it. And then The Hitchhiker.
Great episode. The fascinating one about that is I think it's the only episode based on a radio play. Lucille Fletcher, who was married to Bernard Herrmann, the great composer, who also wrote for Twilight Zone, wrote music for Twilight Zone. She wrote a radio play in the 40s called The Hitchhiker. It was done a number of times on radio, and notably on Suspense, and it starred Orson Welles in the lead. And Rod took it and adapted it and switched the sex to make it a woman, which I think was a good choice to make it more vulnerable. And Inger Stevens is just terrific in that. And Leonard Strong as the creepy hitchhiker she keeps seeing is just so creepy. And, it's a keeper. It's a great episode.
And then the number 10, which we talked about, The Lonely. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Number 9 was Perchance to Dream. Do we?
It's a good one. It's a good one, but again, not, I wouldn't put it in the top 10 of my list. It's effective. Richard Conte is good in it. You mentioned The Godfather earlier. He's in The Godfather. It's okay. It's a strong episode by Beaumont. It was the first one that Beaumont wrote for the show, and it certainly creates a very creepy nightmare world very effectively.
Let's see. Let's go right to the middle. Let's say right in the middle. Okay.
Sure.
Dead Man's Shoes, 123. It's kind of right in the middle.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay, not great. Just kind of obvious. It's not a bad one. They remade it when they brought Twilight Zone back. I think it was Helen Mirren in it. I think Warren Stevens was in it originally in the first version. Yeah.
What's the name of what's the one where the stopwatch where it does
Kind of a stopwatch. It's called a kind of a stopwatch. Rod Serling wrote that one. Again, the idea is better than the execution. The idea, I mean, it's such great fantasy that you would have a stopwatch that could stop time so you could do anything you wanted. You could rob a bank or do anything. It's a very engaging notion.
that's one of the ones that kept being remade when they kept
Yeah.
remaking the Twilight Zone.
Yes.
All right, so Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, George
Yep.
Clayton Johnson. Those are the big three
Yes.
outside of Rod Serling.
Yes, and the fascinating thing is, Ray Bradbury was originally going to be one of the major writers of Twilight Zone. He only ended up writing one episode ultimately because they had a falling out. I have a YouTube channel called Mr. Sci-Fi, and I actually talk about how Rod and Ray Bradbury came to a falling out in their friendship. It's a very interesting story. I only found it out in recent years when I became a very, very close friend to Ray. Because neither Rod nor Ray would ever talk about it publicly, how they had fallen out. And finally, I said to Ray, okay, tell me what happened. And he told me. And it's an amazing story. But early in Twilight Zone, Rod threw open the doors for submissions to try to get other writers because he knew he wouldn't be able to write all of them. He was going to write the lion's share. And they got 500 submissions. They read a bunch of them, and none of them were any good. And he didn't know what to do, so he called Ray Bradbury, who at the time was the leading science fiction writer, and he knew Ray. And he said, "What do I do?" And Ray said, "Come over to the house." He took him downstairs into his office, and he pulled out 4 books. One was by him. One was by John Collier, a British writer. They ultimately adapted a story called The Chaser that John Collier wrote. And the other 2 were by 2 of Ray's protégés, Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont. He said, "Read these and then let's talk." And Beaumont and Matheson became 2 of the major writers. And then like a little later, George Clayton Johnson, who was another one of Ray's protégés, was hired as well. And he was a close friend of Beaumont's. And so all of them knew each other. It was very, I was going to say incestuous, but it was definitely people who knew each other, people who loved each other's work and were reading each other's work.
So Richard Matheson's done so much, and like even like his episode Steel
Yeah.
was later either after the fact credited with the Hugh Jackman movie.
Well, it was actually a direct adaptation. They actually paid Matheson for that. But the Twilight Zone episode is much better. It stars Lee Marvin in a future where human boxing's been outlawed and humanoid robots are the boxers, and Lee Marvin has to go into the ring pretending to be his broken robot so he can get the money. It's a terrific episode. It's a little weird that Lee Marvin didn't really have the physique, so they put him in these black tights. It's a little funky, but still terrific, wonderfully acted. Joe Mantel's terrific in it. And then they made it in the movie with Hugh Jackman. And ironically, they built a full-size giant robot, and I own that robot now. So, because I have a studio, I have 3 sound stages full of spaceships and robots and aliens and spacesuits because I'm now shooting my own shows. My fans gave me $4 million to open my own studio and shoot Space Command, which is this new series I'm doing. And we're also shooting a feature, and then we're about to shoot 5 pilots I'm creating with the creators of Farscape and The Expanse and so forth. So I learned from Rod very, very well, I think.
That's amazing. We'll have you back because you're fascinating. We'll talk about all that stuff.
That'll be fun. I look forward to it.
So of Richard Matheson's, which do you think are his biggest ones? Is the Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, obviously.
Definitely Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is one of his great episodes. Little Girl Lost. It's such a great idea of a little girl falling through a hole in dimensions, and it's beautifully rendered. Very, very good episode. I mean, he's just a great writer in general. I mean, the fascinating thing about Matheson is he had such an impact on the genre. I mean, from I Am Legend, which is like not only influenced vampire fiction, but also was the inspiration for Night of the Living Dead, all the way through to, Somewhere in Time and Duel and so many great people, and The Night Stalker. I mean, just a phenomenal writer. Yeah, but I think his Twilight Zones are generally incredibly strong. I love Death Ship. That's one of my favorites of his. I actually own the spacesuit, one of the spacesuits from that episode as well. It's pretty cool. Matheson was a very quiet man. He had a dry sense of humor, but he was just like very, he was a hard-working guy. Every day went to the typewriter and worked and just really left an incredible body of work.
Charles Beaumont, we've talked about a little bit,
Yes.
but like, the Howling Man, I think is one that people talk
Yeah, and I love
about.
another one of his that I love is Long Live Walter Jameson with Kevin McCarthy as an immortal guy who ultimately gets his comeuppance, to say the least. But also miniature. I think the Robert Duvall episode. Beaumont, before he fell ill, Beaumont was a lightning rod. He was this incredibly gregarious and outgoing and passionate guy, and he brought together this circle of writers, William F. Nolan, George Clayton Johnson, Matheson, John Tomerlin, all these writers who they would go out all the time, they would go to movies, they would drive around the city talking. He was an enormous inspiration to all of these other people. Many of them would not have become writers if not for him. George Clayton Johnson certainly would never have become a writer if not for Beaumont. So he was really, I mean, his effective creative life ended pretty much at age 33, but he packed a lot into that time. And Twilight Zone was the perfect show for him to write for because he really had full creative license, and so his episodes are a lot of fun. Even something like The Jungle, which is not one of the better known ones, with John Daner, about a guy who's come back from Africa and there's a curse on him, and it's pretty creepy and pretty fun.
Fortunately, like they'd all become immortalized, with being part of this show.
Yes.
So George Clayton Johnson, kicked the
Well,
can.
George was funny because when he was writing for Twilight Zone, he had short hair and wore suits and smoked cigarettes. And then after Twilight Zone, the Surgeon General's report came out, and George switched from tobacco to weed, and he became sort of the world's oldest hippie. He had shoulder length hair. He wore dressed in these electric colors, very bright, and he was a fascinating guy. He was a real character, but certainly with something like Kick the Can, I mean, these are. I think Kick the Can is one of the best scripts ever written for television. It's just a jewel.
Number 30 on that list. The other one, which actually is number 21 on the list of the best Twilight Zone episodes, which is one that I love as well, A Game of Pool.
Yes. Again, a superb piece of writing. Jonathan Winters. Originally, George had in mind, a different actor, Burl Ives, who was sort of, again, a heavy set and a very good actor. But they cast Jonathan Winters. Jonathan Winters had just come out of a mental institution, having had a nervous breakdown, and so he was very nervous, and it was a dramatic role for him. But he did a great job with it, and of course, Jack Klugman is phenomenal. I think Jack Klugman did his best work on Twilight Zone. The four episodes he did are just great, and he's great in all four of them. And yeah, Game of Pool is a terrific piece of work.
So that's a good segue to my next thing, which was frequent guests. So Jack Klugman, 4 episodes, Passage for Trumpet, Game of Pool, Death Ship, and In Praise of Pip.
Yes.
And then the other two people with four, nobody had, well, I shouldn't say that. Robert McCord.
Hmm.
We'll get to him in a second.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Burgess Meredith had four, Time Enough
Hmm.
at Last, which is considered one of the most
Yeah,
classic. Printer's Devil, which was during the hour
the
long
hour long.
season.
Yeah, it's okay.
Obsolete Man,
Yes.
and Mr. Dingle the Strong, which we talked about.
Yeah, but The Obsolete Man is a great episode. It's very stylistic, and it really, really speaks to totalitarianism and censorship of books. It packs a punch even to this day, and should, deservedly.
And then John Anderson also visited 4 times.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I interviewed him as well. Yeah, he was a cool guy. But
and
go ahead, please.
no, oh, the Odyssey of Flight 33 I
Great
is one of the
episode.
ones that sticks in my head, where they keep
Yes.
going in through time, and then they
Well,
see
they when they
dinosaur.
look out when they see the dinosaur out the airline
Yeah.
window, and that was the only episode that Rod collaborated with his brother Robert. Robert was he was the editor of Aviation Week and wrote a lot about airplanes. And when Rod came up with this idea, he had Bob basically be his technical advisor.
That's an interesting bit of trivia that Rod Serling's parents named his brother Robert, Rod and Robert. Okay.
Yes, 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 yes,
And then Bill Mumy was in 3 episodes, and then Robert
yes.
McCord,
Yeah.
uncredited in many, but like was in 60 episodes or
That's
so.
crazy. It's crazy. But Bill Mumy, the fun part about Bill Mumy is, I worked with him when I wrote for Babylon 5, and I also am now working with him on Space Command. He's one of our leads in the show. And he just, he is an icon. I mean, going from Twilight Zone to Lost in Space to Babylon 5 and now Space Command. I mean, he's just one of the greats, one of the greats. He was terrific. All of his three episodes are just standouts. Long Distance Call, which is one of the videotape ones, and then, In Praise of Pip, of course, and it's the one where he's the Jerome Bixby one, It's a Good Life, where he has infinite powers. It's just wonderful. I love that.
Another one of the ones that is always
Oh yeah.
reimagined. All right, I
Yes.
got to get Mark out of here. He spent a bunch of time with me. Mark,
Yep.
thank you for writing this book. I can't even tell you how much it's meant to so many people, but to me specifically, you can tell, it's just crazy. It's
Well,
it's a
thanks.
really honor to meet you.
Yeah.
And to be able to pick your brain like this.
Yeah, well, I've really enjoyed it. It's a lot of fun. And as you can tell, yes, this stuff is hardwired in my brain. It's but it's a joy. I mean, I'm glad I didn't write about Wiener Schnitzel. I'm glad I wrote about Twilight Zone, because it's a subject that just, is endlessly entertaining and fun. And we will have to get back together again a second time to talk about all the different shows I've written for, Star Trek Next Gen and DS9 and all that stuff. So, many a story to tell.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. To be honest, I was so focused on the Twilight Zone thing, and then I was like, "Oh, he's done a lot," but I got to spend the whole time on Twilight Zone. I'll email you after. We'll do it. Thank you so much. You've been awesome.
You're very welcome. I've loved it. Thanks, Jeff. You have a good day. Take care.
You too.
Bye.